Hey everyone, today on Tuesday Tips we're going to talk about Ballot Measure 21. Let's get started. Okay, so what is Ballot Measure 21? It's effectively revoking the Costa-Hawkins Act of 1995. What is that? Well, it was a preventative measure so not all things would be under rent control. So for example, if you had a condo, condos are exempt from rent control typically. But in Los Angeles, if it was built prior to 1978, it isn't subject to rent control except for the rent increases, right? So you're not restricted by how much you can or cannot raise rent. Now, by this, we're being revoked, right? So if this measure passes, then basically cities, municipalities, counties, whatever, are going to be able to expand rent control to cover more, units. So, and what is rent control? Let's start with that. So, first of all, rent control is a couple of things. Primarily, rent increases, like limitations. More often than not, like in the city of Los Angeles, it's based off the consumer price index, usually between 3 to 4%. Again, it varies. Right now, because of COVID, there's a total halt. You can't raise rent for 360 days after we're no longer in a state of emergency. The second part, which is also important but not a lot of people talk about, is when you can and can't terminate a lease with a tenant. So it's a bilateral contract, right? Landlord, tenant, we agree on a price, terms, all that. But at the end of the lease, it's up to the tenant if they want to stay or not. You as a landlord can't necessarily just kick them out to bring in someone else, whatever, unless it meets certain guidelines, right? So you have at-fault evictions, which would be things like not paying rent, not following the rules, things like that. Or you have not at-fault evictions, which would be things like if you want to move in to the unit, or you want to move in an immediate family member, or it could be if you're doing a major construction project. There are limitations on the amount. I believe it's $125,000. But all in all, it just restricts what landlords can do. So is this a good thing? Is this a bad thing? Well, let's take a look at the facts. Fact number one, LA County is short 500,000 units. Right? There's a huge housing shortage. We see it all throughout LA. We see a lot of homelessness. We see multiple applications being submitted on places. Right? When we leased out our main house, we got multiple applications within less than 2 weeks. It's just kind of is what it is. There's a huge housing shortage. Let's also take a look at a case study. San Francisco. San Francisco enacted rent control in 1994. Since then, they actually have done studies, and what the report came out with, Chicago Review actually did a kind of like a summary version of it, and what they found was rent control primarily helps those that are already in their homes, that's already under the rent control protections, which makes sense, right? Because if you're already in a place, then you can't raise rent because you're already there. However, those that were new to the rental market, so let's say people who just left home, those who just graduated college, those moving in from out of the area, they all saw the opposite effect, right? Because, which again makes sense, because if you're under rent control, there's no incentive for you as a tenant to move, because you do know that if you move, you're probably going to pay more in rent. So therefore, that keeps housing supply down. So that's what they noticed in San Francisco. Take Los Angeles. As already mentioned, we're short 500,000 units. Already mentioned in previous videos I've done, rent has actually gone up by 65% over the last decade. And a lot of that contributes to low housing options. Now, why is this a big problem in terms of whether this passes or not? Well, as a real estate investor, you have a choice on where you want to invest, right? So when, 1978, when rent control first got enacted in Los Angeles, back then it was really, really hard to invest out of state, right? There was no internet, right? You couldn't do Google Street Scene, you couldn't look at pictures, you couldn't view stats on what stuff was renting for. So really you were almost restricted to where you lived unless you were willing to fly to all these different cities across the United States. Well, that's changed. People can buy properties now without stepping foot in the home. right? You have virtual tours, you have all these things. And the reality is the government has two options to create more housing. Either they can build it or the private sector can build it. Private sector being people like you and me. So if landlords have a choice, they're going to be like, okay, do I invest here where there's more regulation or invest elsewhere? Now, there's pros and cons to both. What I always tell my clients when they ask me if it's worth investing in LA, I always say yes. The two reasons are you generally do bank on appreciation, and even then you have bigger numbers, right? So a 3% increase on a $3,000 a month rent is going to be bigger than a 3% increase on a $1,000 a month rent, somewhere in the Midwest. So cash flow wise, you're dealing with bigger numbers. And the second reason is because a lot of investors are leaving Los Angeles and going to these other cities for these very reasons, because a lot of them are tired of being regulated. So why should I put up with the regulation? Because I know they won't, right? So it means when I have a vacancy, it'll get filled quickly and it'll get filled for top dollar. So really, if you're a tenant and this passes, there's a high probability rents will actually increase even more. So these are just things to keep in mind based off facts like San Francisco, like the fact that rents have already gone up, like that investors have left and there's written documentation of that. We are short housing, and if this passes, now you have more rent control and what that actually means. Love to hear your guys' thoughts. Whatever you choose, whether you're for it or against it, I don't care, just vote. It's really important that you make sure your voice is heard. Thank you guys so much, and I'll talk to you guys next week. Hey everyone, hopefully you liked the video. If so, please don't forget to give it a like, maybe show some love in the comments. Also, don't forget to subscribe. We do have other videos posted. Please go ahead and watch them, enjoy them. They'll be posted somewhere here. Feel free to click or just view the channel in general. Thank you guys so much. I'll see you next week.